Welcome to today's webinar entitled Space Management Strategies for a New Era. My name is Billy Zydik, Manager Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage under the Continuous Learning tab later today. Professional continuing education certificates will be offered for today's program. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box, and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenters. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Andrew Sama and Amy Haberman. Andrew and Amy, take it away.
All right, thank you, Billy. We're so excited to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us today as we engage in this conversation about space management in the new era of higher education. My name is Amy Haberman. I'm a manager with Huron, and I've been with the firm about 3 years. I started my career actually as an environmental health and safety professional. And I think that if anyone can sympathize with that, it's this audience. I know I was on many a speed dial of facilities folks and worked right alongside most of our facilities directors. EH&S and facilities have a lot of overlap, and I have a great understanding of the space that is the complexity of institutional research space, and it's been great to kind of take that framework of knowledge and start to apply it more to space management, facilities management, and in this context of working with many institutions. Thank you for having us, and I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Andrew Sama. I'm a manager in the strategy and operations group within Huron Consulting, same as Amy. I've been here about 2.5 years, and prior to that, I spent 13 years as a university administrator at a Midwestern research institution. During that time there, I was the director of University Facilities Information, the first of that position for that institution. And in the course of doing that, I had a chance to kind of stand up business process, build out a technology suite, in the service of centralizing all the floor plan and space data for that institution and trying to help, figure out how to use that information to better the functions of the institution, right? So I've done sort of firsthand space management work, helped reallocate almost 300,000 square feet of assignable space in a year where we launched 1 million gross square feet of new space. So I've walked in the tall grass of space management in higher ed. And I'm, really enjoying working with clients now to tackle these problems with a whole range of institutions. Another member of our team who couldn't be with us today but contributed greatly to this work is Carolyn Farley. She has 30+ years of experience as a university administrator, very facilities forward and very student space focused. Before we jump into things, I'm going to toss it back to Amy here in a second. I want to make sure we just kind of give the context. We clicked through some of the AIA stuff at the front, and I want to just kind of mention what we're doing here today. We want to talk to you about some of the strategies that we see being very effective for active space management in sort of the new dynamics that we see around space. We'll define sort of what this new era looks like, and then as well, we're going to build. We're going to mention some of the recommendations that we see being very effective, particularly for facilities, focused folks. That come from some of the work we've done with 2 different institutions. A Southeastern Research One institution where we looked at the whole portfolio of administration space. That would be Institution B. And then a Northeastern Research One institution where we looked specifically at a couple of colleges that had 2 different approaches to the use of flexible work. And so we want to share with you our perspective based on some of those engagements, and then all the other work that we have going on. To get us started, I want to toss to Amy to talk us through some of what we hear when we go to college campuses, and maybe some of this will be familiar to you.
And this is very fitting. I come to you from a Midwestern campus right now today, and if hopefully you won't hear any construction, but there is construction going on just outside this office. So we are sympathetic to all the challenges. So we hear a lot of things when we engage with your peers. We have a few kind of scenarios here that have been rolled up and anonymized. Obviously, these are more fictitious than anything, but very relatable, right? So we always hear about how everyone needs their own office, but when you walk through the buildings, no one's to be found. There seems to be very little actual utilization of the space, but no one wants to share their space or give it up. There's always that dean or department chair that has some flavor of the day project that they want to elevate as a priority, maybe a coffee shop when there are 53 other Starbucks on campus. But you have to find a way to make that happen, or fall onto the bad list, right, for those departments that we need to work with. The Department of Trees and Flowers, I love that one. That's an Andrews special. They might be hanging on to space because they're going to recruit that next preeminent faculty, and it's going to happen tomorrow, even though that space has been kind of in their back pocket for the last 8 years. So what do we do about those things? And then there's the overall kind of concern that maybe the buildings aren't getting maintained as frequently or to as high of a standard as was before the pandemic, even though predominantly a lot of campuses have returned to some more on-site work. So these are very common things that we hear when we're out there engaging with your peers. Before we go into kind of the methodology, the framework, the recommendations that we have for active space management, I want to frame our conversation around some common terminology, or at least kind of get us on the same page when we're mentioning these things. What does it mean to us, right? So space management, there are really 3 kind of pillars of space management, and that's capacity, allocation, and utilization. And then when it comes down to it, capacity is how much space is there, how many rooms, how many square feet, what is our capacity for doing work or providing space to our community. Allocation is who is it assigned to, as in the example with the Department of Trees and Flowers. They may be assigned that space, but are they using that space? And that's really the utilization piece. What do we find when we go in the space? Is it actively being used? Is it neglected, etc.? So those 3 components are very important when we consider space management. Now, another component that we're starting to kind of throw in the mix here when it comes to space management is how are we using the space? How are we working in the space? And that kind of lends itself more to this conversation about flexible work, which we're having a lot more often these days. There are several little examples there for each of the where, when, and how, right? How, all related to the work that we do. And there might not only be variations across universities, but there could be variations across departments and units within a university. So there might not be a one-size-fits-all approach to how do we actively manage space for your campus. You might need to kind of take individual considerations for these components. So hopefully that all makes sense to everyone, and our definitions aren't too far off from what you're familiar with.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that helpful framing, Amy. I think I want to touch briefly, we talk and titled this whole presentation, this new era of space. So what do we mean by that? And I want to define that quickly. I'll start with the demand side, if you will, and that's, particularly around flexible work. I think, as Amy just alluded to, there's been a pretty sizable shift since 2020. Schools have returned to campus, but there are now functions that I would argue have gone mostly or even entirely remote on a lot of campuses, right? I think of research administration, I think of IT, in some areas finance, right, or even HR. And importantly, there's significant demand for more flexibility. There was a Coupa HR higher education employee retention survey in 2023 that showed that nearly 70% of employees express a preference for hybrid or remote work. They would like to have some flexibility in their workday. And more than 60% of those folks indicated they felt like their jobs could be done, remotely. So there's certainly demand for more flexibility than even what we see. And that's because 2/3 of employees reported that they are still primarily on site, right? So there's a little bit of misalignment there. And I think schools are recognizing this. We know that the survey of chief human resource officers recently, 50% of them said they're now working or have already implemented long-term remote work policies, right? So I think the takeaway here from a demand perspective as it relates to flexible work is that it's here and it's likely to grow. I think our perspective on this looking forward 5 to 10 years is that as generational shifts occur, you're going to see more and more of this in places where maybe right now it doesn't seem as though it's very likely, right? But it'll continue to grow when there's that much demand. And at the same time this is happening, at some institutions, not all, enrollment is declining, right? It's primarily baccalaureate only institutions. Those are down about 2% from 2008 levels. And we also know that in the next couple of years, that demographic cliff that we've all heard about for years now is predicted to arrive. And for those that haven't heard this yet, that is essentially the prediction. There'll be fewer traditional college-age students due to historical birth rates, and that's set to begin in 2026. And so what this sums to from a demand for space perspective is that, there's just less people in space, generally speaking, right? Fewer employees in office space, potentially, depending on your institution, fewer students in classrooms and academic buildings. But schools still have to maintain all that space, whether it's getting used or not, right? And that process is becoming more costly and more difficult by the year. Inflation's outpacing investment rates, meaning deferred maintenance is, getting worse even with increased investment. Skilled trade shortages are impacting the ability of schools to deliver service levels that, are in line with what's sort of perhaps been accustomed across the building portfolio. And so, I would just say for those that haven't seen the Gordian State of Facilities and Higher Ed report, it's worth a read. It's sourcing of some of what we're showing here, but it lays this all out very starkly. I want to just kind of skip to the end here and say that the bottom line is, in this new era where you have all these dynamics around reduced space use, rising costs, schools are going to end up paying more and working harder to maintain space that they aren't using quite as much. And that's a bad combination, right? So we realize that not all these dynamics are in play at every institution, and even if they are, they're at different levels based on, they could be more or less acute based on the academic focus of the institution, the financial standing, even the local labor market. And so to help us understand what you all are experiencing on this call, I actually want to invite Billy to help us with a poll, because we'd like to know of these issues, right? Lower space utilization, rising costs, staffing shortages or challenges, or something else entirely. What's impacting you on your campuses? And so I see that poll is open. So we'll let that go for just a minute there. But our hope is that, if we can get a feel of, what folks on the call are experiencing, then hopefully we can, at least speak to that in a little more detail if possible. We'll give it another couple seconds to let folks respond, and then all right.
Ooh.
So where can I see the poll results?
Can you see it, Andrew?
I cannot.
Okay, it's split pretty evenly across the three main. We've got 29% indicated lower space utilization,
Okay.
36% rising costs, and 28% staffing shortages and challenges. So really rising costs is the most prevalent issue impacting our attendees today, with the space utilization and staffing shortages kind of really neck and neck right behind there.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing that. I think that's very helpful. We'll keep that in mind as we make our comments. It's just a challenging environment, right? But the good news is we have some options. So Amy, do you want to talk to this real quick?
Yeah, sure. So we found this quote. We thought it was really relevant to this audience and this topic, that space is really a critical resource. It has to be managed just like your financial resources of the institution. Has to be treated like an asset. You need to allocate it and have it aligned with your short and long-term priorities. So very insightful thought there. I'm curious if anyone recognizes this because it came from the APA thought leaders in 2012. So 22 years ago, you guys were well ahead of the
Don't make me older, Amy. Amy, that's only
oh my gosh, yes. I'm better at math, I swear. 12 years ago. Yes, you had the forethought and the understanding and the intuition to know that, like, hey, this is something we need to actively manage. And we're excited to be able to kind of share some of our thoughts and work around this topic. So what we're introducing here is a facilities and space management framework. This is really similar to kind of an operational excellence framework as well that could be applied to maybe other functional areas of your institution. You'll see it's organized like a pyramid, and that is very intentional. There are definitely foundational or essential aspects of good management practices when it comes to facilities and space that we think are fundamental, that need to be implemented. Some of those things are related to governance, policy, execution, accountability, things of that nature. And then as you mature as an organization, you're going to start to have additional tools and resources to help you make decisions or manage aspects of your operation. And that's the data and technology management piece. And a lot of the data and technology management can inform your metrics and your understanding of your overall operational service and performance. And then really capping it off is the workforce strategy. So executing the work, having the resources to do so, the succession planning and the sustainability needed to continue to move forward as an organization. So it's within this framework that we kind of look at when we do our assessments, when we work with your peers, that we tend to dig in and do a much deeper analysis regarding specific components that you may find in each of these elements. And I will let Andrew speak more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Amy did a pretty good job of summarizing this overall. I won't belabor it. I know we want to get into the space management piece, but I think at the end of the day, we're looking, does the organization have a clear vision and scope of responsibilities? Does it have org structure, funding model, documented strategy to support this? How's it using data technology and IT support? Does it have what it needs to understand and manage operations? Do they have standardized processes that promote efficiency at a reasonable cost? And do they have an effective plan to hire, retain, train, and grow their employees, right? And that can be within any of the functional areas, right? We've applied this to custodial groups. We've applied this to construction management groups. Today, we're going to talk about it in the specific context of space management. And so I want to dive into what that looks like when you drill in, right? And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide because there's a lot to unpack here, but then I promise you we'll get into the recommendations. I think, this is important to understand because this is sort of the core capabilities that we think an institution needs to effectively manage space. And I'm going to start with the capabilities there at the top that would comprise basically the bottom layer of that pyramid from the last slide. You can see the little graphic there, hopefully kind of orients you to what we're talking about. These are capabilities that speak to organization and strategy of the institution, right? And I'll actually start at number 2 on this list in the table that you see here. And that's governance structure. As it relates to space, what we're looking for here is the existence and efficient operation of decision-making approaches around space, right? What is the process for building a new building or for getting a major renovation or a lease done, right? Is it just catching the right VP in the hallway? Is it, catching the dean at the right moment? Or is there a process with some data and some approval gates, right? More mature organizations will have an established process and groups with appropriate decision-making authority to govern the use of space. And next, we'll talk about policy and guidelines. This is about having that high-level guidance that ensures that decision makers are aligned with the overall institutional strategy. And this can take a lot of forms, from principles, right? Things that are broad and expansive, like all space is university space, right? To very specific policies that will outline in detail, the square feet per employee at various levels of the organization. All of those things are needed. The key assessment that we make is, is the institution have the right mix of these policies and guidelines to ensure that the planning and implementation are consistent across the board and their mission aligns, right? Another key area in this organization and strategy part of the framework, right? Again, this is the bottom part of our pyramid, is roles and responsibilities. And in short, this is, does the institution have the people with the right authority and scope of control to ensure that the policies and guidelines are followed and the decisions are implemented? Institutions don't do a great job of planning space if they don't have space planners or people that have space planning responsibilities and authority. So no matter how great the governance structure is and the policy documents, you got to align those resources with the plan. And so then the last item in this area is actually the first. I just wanted to come to it sort of last from a narrative standpoint, and that's leadership. And if we think of the truly foundational aspects of space management, or I would argue really any management, it's about leadership. Are the leaders in the organization communicating consistently and routinely about the importance of space management and reinforcing the other capabilities, right? The governance structures, the policies, or are they working around it, right? Are they seeking feedback and actively managing the function, or are they kind of silently communicating that it's not a priority? Leadership makes a huge difference in how effective the rest of all these capabilities can be. I want to move up the pyramid quickly with these bottom two, 5 and 6, and just touch on these other capabilities that are so important in this new era that we just described, and that's data and reporting. As we'll show here in a bit, having trustworthy data, particularly about the utilization of space, is critical now more so than ever before. It's important that institutions have the processes and tools in place to gather, analyze, and report on that information. And so that makes up that middle part of our framework. And if you have all these things in place and at a reasonable level of maturity, then you're on your way to producing great outcomes for your employees and for your faculty and your students. That's that top bit of the pyramid there. Unfortunately, we know that there are some challenges in getting this all right. I won't work through all of these right now because we're going to cover some of this naturally as we talk through the recommendations and some of what we found at institutions. But I want to focus on one note here, and that is the importance and the challenge of striking the right balance between empowerment and consistency and between policy and adaptability. Particularly as organizations scale up and they become more decentralized, it's just not possible to be on top of every single decision about space across an institution, not without creating some kind of governance structure that's just so onerous you wouldn't get anything done. So as I often think about when I'm dealing with my kids, you got to pick your battles, right? And I think in the context of space management, I think that means being thoughtful about your portfolio of space and the associated costs and benefits. So for example, if my institution has 3 times as much office space as classroom space, maybe I need to lean in a little on the policy and be a little more specific around the office component. If my institution is really focused on research growth at the moment, maybe I want to invest in more data and reporting infrastructure to get to like research dollar density metrics, right, or productivity metrics around research space. The good news is when we assess ourselves on these capabilities, we get a good sense of where to focus and where our institutions may need to adjust in order to actively manage space for this new era. And so let's talk about what we find when we do that, right? When we do these assessments, it leads to, recommendations, and that's what we're here to talk about today. While recommendations will vary by institution, we find that a lot of them are similar because, across these core capabilities, because a lot of institutions that we work with are of a similar sort and maybe have some similar issues. We're going to focus today on 3 of those that we think are most important to active management. First, and perhaps most simply, lots of institutions need to connect flexible work and space allocation from a policy standpoint. We'll talk more about that. Then often we see a need to incorporate space utilization into existing space governance processes. And finally, and most commonly, and I would almost argue from my perspective most urgently, we see a need to get better space utilization data to inform the conversations and the decision making around space allocation and use. And we'll talk about each of these recommendations in detail. We're of course happy, as was mentioned at the top, to take questions at the end of this or offline, afterwards if time doesn't allow. So let me walk through, some of what we've recommended here on these 3. The first I'll talk about is around the policy component. Most institutions at this point have very detailed space guidelines. And as I mentioned earlier, increasingly institutions are now also building more robust, flexible work guidelines and making them more long-term, right? This is what we consider to be sort of foundational level of maturity here. As a side note, I'll just say if your institution does not have those things, right? If you do not have the space guidelines, if you do not have flexible work policy, that's a red flag. You'll want to address that soon. But even when they do, which is what we most often find in institutions, we find that often those policies are pretty siloed, right? The guidelines for space don't say anything about what happens if you're working on campus only 2 days a week. And the flexible work guidelines don't say anything about what employees should expect regarding dedicated office space. And so this seems obvious, but schools have to align and explicitly tie these policies together in order to mature themselves in ways that address these pressures of the new era of space use. If you just allow the norm around one office space to one worker to proliferate and go on historically, you're going to have some challenges, right? So you got to start with policy to address that. And that's what we recommended in Institution A, right? This is the Northeastern School Research one that we talked to about different colleges, right? We made a recommendation to, hey, get the policies aligned, right? But the key thing is to support that recommendation. We did a bunch of analysis and testing, and this is so important to do when you're considering a policy change like this. In the end, we gave them a range of ways to implement, some policy options, right? Of who gets space at what levels, 2 days, 3 days, what are some of the various options? And in the end, we could show them, depending on what policy options they chose, they could save tens of millions of dollars in new construction and operational costs over time. Right? So the recommendation here is not only to align the policy, but do some homework, do some analysis, do some testing to consider the impact of these policies, right? It'll help you surface the benefits, help you identify some risks too, but identifying those benefits is so important to building a case for change. If you're going to adjust how people are using their space on campus, we know it's a touchy topic, right? It's so helpful to come to them with, here's why. Right, we're going to adjust the policy around who gets office space, but we're doing it because it's going to save X, Y, Z dollars, right? That can go back into the mission, right? So that's sort of our first policy recommendation, is around aligning the policy. And then, another typical and very important recommendation that we find ourselves offering is to formally integrate utilization analysis into the space governance or space request review process that already exists at the institution, right? And what this does, by sort of formally and explicitly calling this out, is it ensures that existing space costs are considered. It really helps surface repurposing opportunities, and it increases the overall transparency around the process of collecting and using space utilization data, both for the requester, right? When we tell them, hey, when you come with this space request, we're going to look at your utilization of space. They understand, where is this information that the institution is collecting about utilization in my space, where is it being used? Well, now they know it's in this space governance process. And it also really helps the institution, right? The institution can understand, okay, this person's asking me for space. The dean is asking for a coffee shop. Does he really need the coffee shop, right? And so from a maturity standpoint, most institutions will already have some sort of space governance process to approve new requests for, construction, for leases, for major renovations. All we're saying is adjust that process to increase the maturity of it, essentially, right? Put utilization data very explicitly into that. And I'll tell you, it won't take but maybe 2 or 3 space requests being deferred or denied, right? And it'll start to change the way people are thinking about space use, right, in their units. When you do this, what's going to be interesting is you see the potential for significant savings, right? When we worked with Institution B, this is the Southeastern School, we found somewhere between $13 and $50 million in cost avoidance for in-scope space over a decade. Now, these savings are driven by the delta between new construction and renovation. It's typically cheaper to renovate than build. And by the avoidance of new operational costs for custodial, maintenance, and renewal, and utilities that would have come along with, new square footage to the campus portfolio. And this says nothing about campus carbon emissions, right? We know those go down too when you don't build out, and that's an important goal for so many of our institutions. Now, I want to be clear. right? It's not all roses and rainbows and puppies, right? These are not immediate savings, and they're not guaranteed, right? They come through attrition over time as opportunities are found to reallocate space in lieu of building, right? And so you have to find those opportunities and you have to leverage them. That's why you're doing it as part of the governance process. Those opportunities will hopefully surface themselves. And let's be honest, back to the leadership thing, it requires some tough decisions to be made, right? There's no small amount of change management that's required, to realize these savings, right? But it's important to do this kind of analysis because I think it helps leaders understand the impact of their space choices in ways that maybe previously weren't considered or perhaps fully understood, right? So this is exciting, right? We can save tens of millions of dollars. That's great. We can lessen the operational burden on our stressed out facilities groups by not adding additional square footage we don't need, right? That's awesome. What's not to love here, right? Why don't institutions do this more regularly? And I think it's in part because there's really strong incentives to build new space, right? It's easier to fundraise for new construction than for renovation. It's hard for leaders to tell their teams they're going to have to consolidate space. And let's be honest, new buildings are exciting, right? They get a YouTube video up about, the opening of the thing. The politicians come out as a big, slicing thing with the big scissors, right? They're legacy makers. And I also think a factor, though, is that I think most institutions don't always grasp the size of the opportunity by not building. And that's because they lack the right data to understand the problem. And so if you think about most of the historical reporting about the use of space, it focuses on what are ultimately allocation metrics, right? What are the employees per square foot of office space? What are the students per seat in a classroom? These metrics ultimately describe how the space is allocated. Think back to our definitions at the top, but it's not what's happening in the day-to-day. And so if historically an institution did try to do space utilization, like what is happening in the space, it was mostly in sort of bite-sized chunks and very focused, right? It was, let's look limited term, focused at this particular building or this particular college for a particular period of time. But now technologies exist and are becoming cost-effective and easier to implement that would allow institutions to capture real-time, relatively detailed utilization data at scale across entire portfolios of buildings. And, in order to make an argument for some of these policy and governance things that we've talked about, these recommendations, and relieve the pressure that we see building on facilities and space operations, you're going to need this data, right? You need hard data to counter some of the narratives that are out there, some of what Amy described at the top, right? And so I think the good news, as I mentioned, is that these options are out there, right? From door swipe data to Wi-Fi occupancy to sensor data, these options exist and can be, either are already in place at your institution or they can be piloted at a reasonable cost. At Institution B, we identified 3 different technologies that were either already in use or could be piloted at a reasonable cost to create a really strong foundation for data-informed space decisions. The key is just to get something you can trust to understand that true utilization piece, not the allocation, right? That's what's key in this new era. And this is important because when you do this, you may be shocked at what you find in terms of the actual utilization. We've worked with a couple of institutions where we've looked at different, types of utilization data, and some of it has been surprising, right? So this will obviously vary from building to building, from campus to campus, from institution to institution. But I think one of the takeaways for us has been that where you are experiencing low utilization, you could be wasting millions of dollars a year in what I'll frame as sort of excess operational costs. That's what we found at Institution B, right? We looked at 4 specific buildings, and I want to make a note here that those 4 buildings contain some of the most flexible groups on campus, right? So they were outliers in the sense that, it had finance, HR, advancement, IT, sponsored research, sponsored programs from research, right? So it was pretty highly concentrated with flexible work, which may not be the case across the entire campus. But in those buildings, as they were, the institution was spending $1.5 million a year more in custodial maintenance and utilities per year than would have been incurred if they were in sort of a right-sized space, right? A space that actually, was commensurate with the usage of the space. Now, I want to be clear, these dollar figures are not cost savings that you're going to realize in the near term, right? You can't just turn off the AC, to 80% of the building if the utilization is at 20%. We recognize that. I think the way, there's some things you can do on the margins. You can adjust custodial routes. You could adjust renewal schedules potentially. But, I think the way to think about these numbers and to communicate them to leadership is as a tax. This is the tax. This is the cost of underutilization of space. When we allow that building to languish, right? This is the dollar cost of that. Now, so it's really an argument for better utilization of space. Now, I'll note in some extreme cases, it can be worth asking the question, is this space even needed at all moving forward, right? Demolition and divestment may need to become slightly more common approaches, or at least more regular considerations than historically has sort of been the case in higher ed, right? We know this is not easy. Higher education is not particularly well versed in getting rid of space and decommissioning buildings. The campus is a symbol of the institution. We recognize this, right? Alumni remember their experience on campus. We plug that for fundraising pitches, right? And so it's just it's a dynamic that we know is uncomfortable, but may need to become more a part of the conversation. And so, in the end, what we're looking for is for every institution to have the right amount of purpose-built space that serves the organization's mission without incurring unsustainable costs. And so, whether you're looking to, reallocate space, repurpose space, divest from it, it's going to be critical to do so with some solid data to back the recommendation, right? That data and analysis is only possible in this new era if you have actual utilization data. You can't do it with allocation data, right? If you only use allocation data, it's always going to tell you that the space is full, right? That's always going to be the answer. What's fun about investing in this utilization data, though, is that it's not just about space, usage and sort of responding to space requests. It has a lot of usages across the institution. And so, some that we have seen, right, there's a Southeastern R1 that uses utilization data to right size and to target their renewal investment, right? If I've got $1 million to spend on, upgrading, an academic facility, should it be the one that gets a ton of student usage, or should it be one that's slightly, that's not used at all? Well, that's a pretty straightforward answer, right? If you know how students are using the space. We know another institution, we reported on this at the APA conference, that they're using IoT sensors, right, to right size custodial routes, right, and to adjust custodial routes in buildings based on usage. And it's not just even in facilities, right? In campus safety, having access to the kinds of data that's out there now, right? Particularly some of these Wi-Fi solutions that can report in real time. You can think of game days, college graduations, Friday and Saturday nights, weather events, right? Where do I want to, what buildings have a lot of people in them right now? Where can I adjust my patrols? Where can I adjust where my cameras are pointing from a closed circuit system, right? There's a lot of use there, and the site planning, right? If we're going to give the dean the coffee shop, where should it really go, right? Where are people trafficking campus? This data can help with all of that. So it's not just sort of taking something away from people. I'm going to use this space utilization data to make it harder for you to get space. Some people will make that argument. It's also, we can improve the operations of the institution overall, right? And so, I think, the key point, I just want to summarize here real quick, right? Because we've just covered a lot of ground, and I'm talking a lot. It's weird, I can't see anybody else, and I wish I could, but we'll get to Q&A here in a second. So I just want to kind of recap that, the three things we're focused on for active space management: align the policies, right? Enhance space governance, and invest in space utilization data. I think if you do these three things, it's really going to move you forward in your ability to address some of the challenges that we see in this new era. And I want to point out with this slide, schools are doing this, right? Schools are making progress here. This may feel like a lot to some of you, but schools are taking a variety of approaches to enact these recommendations. And, this isn't all coming from us. Some of what we show here with these names of schools, this is just stuff that's publicly out there, on websites. These are not necessarily, these are not clients of ours necessarily. This is just stuff that, have been in the news. And so we captured these, but you're seeing schools, demolish and divest space. You're seeing them adjust, office schedules and prioritize janitorial cleaning schedules. You're seeing them deploy sensor networks, right? And aside from that, we see schools adjusting their university budget models, right, to encourage spaces, the schools and groups to relinquish unnecessary space. We see schools producing sort of opt-in incentive programs for faculty and staff to utilize shared workstations. From a policy standpoint, I already talked about the meshing of space and flexible work guidelines. We also see schools from a policy standpoint dictating in-office rotations for hybrid units, right? So instead of letting it sort of just be anybody can come anytime for your 3 days a week, off school, department X is going to come on Monday, department Y is going to come on Tuesday, department Z is going to come on Wednesday, and we're going to ensure sort of the higher utilization of the building by sort of being prescriptive about how flexible work occurs, right? And then, we see in the design of space, people just becoming more flexible and ensuring that spaces can flip from being just a meeting room to a meeting room in a classroom, right? Or, they can just accommodate a lot of different needs across staff, student, community members, industry partners. And so there's a lot of ways to approach this. This will be depending on your institution and your culture and your local dynamics. Different strategies and approaches may make more or less sense. But the key here is that you can take action, right? You can do this, you can make progress, and so we know that can be touchy. We know there's some things to be thinking about. I mentioned that I would talk about a few of these. I've mentioned a few times the realization of the efficiencies that you find. We've talked about some eye-popping numbers, tens of millions of dollars as potential savings. They won't just happen automatically. You'll need, staff and faculty focused on doing this and with the right roles and responsibilities, the right policies and guidelines. You need leadership around this to actually to recoup some of the savings that are out there potentially. And I talked before about just that balance between policy and practice, right? I won't belabor it, but just striking, if you have overly prescriptive policies, they risk making things so efficient, they'll be a detriment, right? People won't buy into what you're doing. But if you don't say enough, right, about what you need to have happen, things kind of go off on their own, and you get these perceptions of inequality, right? You get this perception that, this group gets to have whatever space they want, and my group is constrained. So finding that balance is really important. And then, really just can't stress enough the need for change management and communication, right? Take a thoughtful, comprehensive approach to whatever you decide to do and communicate about it, right? There's methodologies and tools out there to help you do this. This is something that we work with clients on. You just really have to build, if there's one thing to think about in this area, it's a case for change. You have to explain to people, why are we changing something about what we do around space? That's where the data becomes so important, but that's really, that's some great advice for how to do this. So with all these recommendations that we've just laid out there, right, all these things that we say you can do, I think what we want to do is, again, hear from you. So I want to invite Billy to throw up another poll for us and ask, what do you want to learn more about of what we've described? And we'll do some Q&A here in just a second. What makes sense, to you, or what are the things that you want to learn more about from these options that we discussed, right? About aligning policies and practices, enhancing space governance, investing in and leveraging, space utilization data. So again, I'll give this a few seconds to fill out. For whatever reason, when I'm screen sharing, I'm not going to see the results, I don't think. So I'll rely on Amy to kind of maybe recap this for us when we get it done. But hopefully this has been helpful to you all. We're excited to hear some questions and to connect with folks. So hopefully you guys are getting those ready too. And Amy, just let me know when we've got some critical mass on the poll.
All right. Well, this one was not as split. Coming in at 50%, we have how to invest and execute with space utilization data. So seems like there's the most interest in that topic, in learning more about how to use that data. And I have a follow-up question. I'm hoping we can hear from you, Andrew, on that. And
Okay.
then followed by enhancing space governance and aligning policies and practices.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I think that tracks, right? I think there's a lot of desire for, you know, more information around space and utilization data, right? You know, I think our facilities folks know the importance of some good data, right? And so, you know, Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about how this can, you know, if we do all this, what the impact can be?
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrew did a great job of explaining kind of the three main areas where you can take action to really improve the perspectives on your campus. And so here we just have a reminder of maybe the sentiments that we might hear when we go out and engage with institutions. But if you take the opportunity to implement some of these active space management practices, hopefully we can kind of flip the conversation and it can become more about, you know, the conversation around our utilization data and engagement with building occupants has helped us understand how to optimize the space in the building, right? So like, let's use that data. Or our space governance process has addressed the dean's interest in a coffee shop using data and planning guidelines. So I guess she gets a Starbucks in the union. And I am offended that it's a woman. It could be, I feel like that was a dig at me, Andrew. Our departments understand the costs associated with space use and are finding new ways to use space effectively. I think that's a really important one. And then service schedule as well. Our service schedule is more efficient now that the custodial team knows how we're utilizing the space and where attention is needed. So super important to have that information. I want to actually, can we transition into questions, Andrew, now? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this does conclude the official course and we'll be transitioning to Q&A now. I'm just going to plug a question in right now. You talked a lot about the reliance on technology, sensors, Wi-Fi data. A lot of institutions might have limited funds or resources to invest in those types of things. So is it possible to gather this same level of utilization data through a manual process? Or what's your experience maybe deploying other strategies besides the newfangled technology?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would say is, you know, do some homework. We're not here to recommend a particular vendor or anything, but I would say, you know, do your homework on the cost of some of those technologies, right? They may not be as much as you think, and you can deploy them in limited ways, right, that control that cost, right? You know, put it into a building, put it into a couple of buildings, right? And I think you'll find that the cost might be a little more palatable. You know, but you know, if that's not an option on the table, which I can understand. Of course, there are some other ways to do it, right? You know, your institution may have door swipe data. You know, that's something that, you know, from security and access standpoint, that was something that a lot of schools invested in years ago. And you know, you may be able to pull that out with a little bit of legwork and at least have a perspective. Right now, there's a whole range of you know, sort of considerations and issues that come with door swipe data in particular, but it is one that a lot of institutions have, right? So, you know, you do have to account for things. People, depending on where the building is, right? People are going to hold the door open. If it's a heavily foot traffic, you know, area, your numbers are going to be skewed by that, right? You know, obviously it's going to be skewed by what are the access restrictions on the building, right? Is it open 24/7? Is it locked down 24/7? Right? You're going to find, like we found on one institution, there was an office building slightly off campus that you kind of had to drive to. Nobody was really walking up to it, and it had 24/7 access control. So you know, you had to swipe in. So people were generally getting to that building with a single occupancy vehicle, one by one, sort of walking up, swiping to go in. So the door swipe data for that building was really good, right? You know, that was a very good indicator of you know, people coming in and out of the building. That same institution looking at door swipe data for a building on, you know, the main campus that was, you know, academically sort of inclined and open, you know, during the workday, but only closed, you know, access controlled at night. That data not really helpful, right? So you need to kind of understand the context behind it, but that's at least a data source that you may have. You know, you can always do manual observations, right? You know, you can have somebody sit there with the clipboard, right? The thing with that is be prepared to answer the questions about why, right? That's a little more intrusive. And so, you know, just that back to that change management communication part, you're going to have to communicate about, well, here's why we're looking at this. you know, and I think a really important thing is, you know, what are we going to do with the data, right? Talk about that up front, right, and share it widely and make sure people understand what's being captured and why and how it's being used, right? So, you know, but again, I would just circle back to you may find some of these technology solutions to be a little more cost effective than you expect. And just to give people a sense, you know, I know there's options to do a pilot for about, you know, 500,000 square feet that would be something like $15,000 to $20,000, right? So, I mean, I don't know that that's, you know, given the potential for some of the savings that I described, right, tens of millions of dollars, it can be a reasonable investment, right?
Yeah,
so.
And absolutely, you can pilot it in certain areas or pockets of campus, and you know, you don't have to deploy everything all at once. So see what kind of good information you get from a small study, maybe initially.
That's right.
What about if there's like lack of incentive, right? How do you have that conversation with leadership? Who should you get involved in the conversation? And then how do you have the conversation around incentivizing if maybe you don't have the data at your disposal just yet?
Yeah, you know, I think this is why the data is so important, right? You know, I think it is hard to have that conversation without some new, you know, factor to share, right? And I think that's where you know, the data is just so critically important. You know, I would say you want to engage at the highest level that you can, right? And I think you know, it's about building that case for change, you know, and it'll vary by institution, right? If your institution has a budget model that charges for space, right now, like that could be something that you use to your advantage. We know there's varying degrees to which that is successful or not successful, and particularly for admin units, often don't pay for their space as opposed to academic units. So you may have a challenge there because that's where a lot of the flexible work is occurring, right? These are the admin units, but they may not pay for space. So, you know, it's going to vary a little bit by institution. But I think, you know, when you lay out a case in kind of the way we did here, right, that there are, you know, if you can get a reasonable estimation of what's the actual utilization, right, something that's irrefutable, like, hey, look, this is how many people are swiping into the building. This is how many bodies are in this building, right, and it's really low, and this is the cost and the tax to the institution for this, right, it's going to open the conversations with leadership. They don't want to waste money, right, budgets are tight, right, and you know, the mission of these institutions is so important, we don't want to forego that, right, for empty space. So I think you'll get a receptive audience with leadership, but you got to bring some data and some analysis, right? I see from Billy we've got some questions from the audience, so feed them to us. How do I get those? Let's
Okay, let's go. We have one person who is asking for you to re-reference the higher education report that you mentioned earlier.
Just the survey of folks that want flexible work. This is the Coupa HR survey. Like 70% of folks, you know, want flexible work. Is that the one they're talking about?
Might have been the Gordian report.
Oh, the Gordian state of facilities and higher education. Yeah, that's Gordian. We'll give them some free advertising here.
Yeah, we also have references. You'll have access to the slides, and all the references will be included in there as well.
Yep.
Okay, and they have another question. Could you list a few of the new technologies being used for campus and traffic data?
Yeah, you know, the traffic data is not one that we have waded into. So that's not going to be an area I'm going to have much to say about. But I think, you know, when we talk about these new technologies, you know, frankly, they're not always wildly new. I mean, I think Wi-Fi data monitoring has been around for a while. I think what's happened is it's getting more scalable and cost effective, and you know, the implementation times are shorter. You know, and I will acknowledge here, I am not an IT expert, right? So if there's folks on the call who know this a little better, they may be offended by the simplicity with which I explain this. But you know, I think there was a time in my recollection, back when I sat in my old chair at an institution doing space management and first looked at some of these Wi-Fi types of things, you know, they kind of required you to log in essentially, right? To register and say, yes, I want to let this software sort of know where I am and what I'm doing, right? You had to kind of log into a network or to the tool. And now the nature of our devices, right, is they're constantly pinging these wireless access points, whether they're logged into the network or not, right? And so I think they're now able to read those pings in such a way that it gives you a pretty good estimation of what's going on in the space, right? And it's anonymized, and it's not kind of so intrusive as maybe some other things have been. So I think the technology isn't necessarily wildly new. I think the application and implementation of it is becoming a little less onerous, a little more cost effective. But Wi-Fi is certainly sort of the number one thing here. I'll also mention there are sensor deployments out there now. They tend to be a little more expensive, right? But those do exist, and can also be used. The thing to be mindful there, those often feel a little more intrusive. People will notice the sensors up, right? And they'll ask questions. And again, change management and communications. You'll tell them before they come in. You'll tell them that they're there. You'll do a bunch of things that make that happen. But people just have a different reaction to that, right? The Wi-Fi stuff kind of sits in the background and doesn't generate the same level of angst, I think, with folks in the space. You still want to communicate about it. You still want to talk about it and do some of the good principles there of change management communication, but it's a little less intrusive. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. So, like I said, I don't think there's anything wildly new, as much as just they're getting cheaper and more effective. Like all pieces of technology, right? If you think of a big screen TV, 10 years ago, they're a whole lot cheaper and bigger now, right? So, what else did we have, Billy?
We have one that says, what are your thoughts on merging and optimizing the functions of space and facilities management and centralized scheduling programs?
Yes. Okay. So, yes, I should have mentioned, right? Scheduling softwares are another source of utilization data, right? Now, they can be messy to untangle, right? They're a little cleaner typically in classroom, space assessments, right? But, when you get into office and conference room space, it can be a little messy to try to untangle that. You can do it, but that's another great source that I should have mentioned. I think it's a great idea. I mean, it's typically a pretty big project, right? To do that at scale. Right? Just because many institutions, those scheduling softwares are pretty decentralized, right? You may have one scheduling software that you're using around class scheduling, but when you get into conference rooms and other types of non-academic use of classrooms, sometimes that's in another system, right? Could be off somebody's calendar on the side of their desk, right? Could be in their Outlook, could be any number of different things. But there's ways to bring that together, right? And absolutely, that's a really good way. To understand how space is truly being used, right? Now, one thing to be sensitive to with that is what's the show rate, right? There's a lot of standing appointments where somebody doesn't show up, right? And so, you'll want to be mindful to that. But certainly, right, you want to leverage what's available to you, right? And start small would be my advice, right? Pick one of the softwares that's most widely used, dive in, create some analysis tools around that type of data, show that to leadership, get them understanding what it's telling them and what it's not telling them, and say, hey, if we want to learn more, if we want to get a clearer picture, here's this next data source we should bring in. And can we devote some resources to doing the analysis and doing the legwork to make that more feasible, and just build block by block. You got to start somewhere, right? Would be my advice. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to say thank you so much, Amy and Andrew. You've gotten quite a few thank yous and great presentation in the chat box. So again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. And as always, to our attendees, thank you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to be with us. So until next time, be safe, be healthy, and be kind to one another. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
See everybody.
Bye, everyone.